January 17th, 1945. Snow fell in thick, silent layers across the Ardennes, muffling the distant echoes of artillery. The battlefield was a frozen wasteland, littered with debris, abandoned rifles, and the occasional muffled groan of a wounded soldier. German troops, exhausted and frostbitten, trudged through the white expanse, their breath visible in the frigid air. Faces pale, uniforms torn, and morale shattered. They moved like shadows, weighed down by hunger, cold, and the unrelenting pressure of retreat. Amid this desolation, a faint glow flickered from a nearby clearing, the makeshift American field hospital. Inside, nurses moved quickly but deliberately, faces marked with fatigue, yet eyes filled with determination. Blankets were stacked in neat piles. Hot soup simmered over portable stoves, and the soft rustle of caring hands cut through the relentless howl of the wind. When the first group of German soldiers approached, hesitation froze them in place. They expected orders, bullets, or reprimands. Instead, they were met with gentle words, warm blankets, and the unexpected sight of human kindness amid the storm of war. Shock, disbelief, and a fragile sense of relief flickered across their eyes, momentarily dissolving the years of indoctrination and fear. This small act of compassion would ripple far beyond the snow-covered clearing, leaving its mark on those who had come to expect only cruelty. That'd be why the winter of 1944, the Western Front had become a patchwork of frozen forests, ruined villages, and smoldering roads. The Allied forces, having secured Normandy in June, had steadily pushed eastward, liberating France and Belgium, and forcing German troops into a desperate, defensive posture. Supplies were stretched thin, and the once feared Wehrmacht found itself battling hunger, frostbite, and an enemy whose numbers and resources seemed inexhaustible. In December, Hitler launched what would become known as the Ardennes Offensive, an attempt to split Allied lines and capture the vital port of Antwerp. The offensive, codenamed Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, relied on surprise, speed, and overwhelming initial pressure. For the German soldiers on the ground, however, the dream of victory was quickly eclipsed by harsh reality. Sub-zero temperatures, treacherous terrain, and inadequate winter clothing turned the advance into a slow, punishing crawl. Soldiers fell ill or froze, weapons jammed, and rations dwindled to near nothing. Exhaustion etched itself into every face, and the morale of troops, once buoyed by ideology and the promise of quick victories, began to fracture under relentless adversity. Meanwhile, behind the front lines, the Allied forces established field hospitals to care for the wounded, both American and German. These hospitals were not luxurious. They were makeshift tents or commandeered buildings, lit by flickering lanterns and heated by small stoves. Nurses and medics worked in long shifts, often risking artillery fire to reach the wounded. Their mission was straightforward yet dangerous: stabilize the injured, prevent death from cold or infection, and maintain the fragile thread of humanity amid the chaos of total war. Medical ethics, though under pressure in wartime, remained a guiding principle. The Geneva Conventions dictated that all wounded soldiers, regardless of nationality, deserved care. American nurses, in particular, were acutely aware of this responsibility. They navigated the moral complexity of providing aid to enemy soldiers, men who, hours before, had been on the other side of the battlefield, armed and ready to kill. By early January, German soldiers captured or left wounded on the snow-covered Ardennes terrain were often on the brink of death from exposure rather than injury alone. Hypothermia set in quickly, and frostbite claimed fingers and toes before any surgical intervention could begin. In this context, the arrival of American medics and nurses was not only a logistical relief, but a psychological shock. Soldiers conditioned to expect brutality now faced acts of genuine kindness. Blankets, food, and medical attention were not mere tools of survival. They became symbols of a fragile, unexpected humanity in the heart of war. This combination of desperation, exhaustion, and sudden compassion set the stage for encounters that would leave a profound mark on both sides. German soldiers, trained for obedience and distrust, found themselves unprepared for warmth and care in the midst of death and destruction. The field hospitals, designed as instruments of healing, became spaces where ideology and humanity collided in small, telling moments. The battlefield, white and silent under the snowfall, seemed to pause, allowing these encounters to resonate. Every blanket handed out, every bandage applied, was a quiet defiance of the relentless logic of war, a moment where soldiers and nurses met not as enemies, but as human beings struggling against the same bitter cold, the same hunger, and the same fear of death. These moments, small yet profound, reflected not only the dire circumstances of the winter of 1944 to 1945, but also the underlying truth of war. No strategy, no weapon, no ideology could fully suppress the simple, enduring impulse to care for one another. The German soldiers' disbelief in the face of such care would soon culminate in a scene that, though modest in scale, carried a symbolic weight far greater than the battlefield itself. As January 1945 pressed on, the conditions in the Ardennes worsened. Roads were slick with ice, shell craters filled with freezing water, and supply lines struggled to deliver even basic necessities. German soldiers, already weakened by months of retreat and attrition, faced a new enemy, the bitter cold. Frostbite claimed more men than bullets during this period, and hunger gnawed relentlessly at morale. Amid this bleak reality, field hospitals became lifelines, not only for survival, but for preserving the fragile sense of humanity that war threatened to erase. American field hospitals were scattered strategically behind the front lines, often located in abandoned homes, barns, or hastily constructed tents. Nurses and medics moved with a combination of urgency and precision, their hands deftly sorting bandages, administering medicine, and distributing hot meals and blankets. Every decision was a balance between efficiency and compassion. Supplies were limited, yet every blanket, every spoonful of soup, every touch of reassurance was extended to those in need, regardless of which uniform they wore. For the nurses, the moral challenge was constant. German soldiers had been the enemy only hours before, yet their wounds demanded attention. The Geneva Conventions provided guidance, but the reality of treating someone trained to kill one's comrades was emotionally complex. Nurses wrote later in diaries that these moments were among the most difficult and the most humanizing of the war. The tension of tending an enemy soldier while feeling the common vulnerability that war imposed. Compassion became a deliberate act of courage, a statement that humanity could survive even in the chaos of battle. The German soldier's perspective adds another layer to this context. Many were young conscripts, drafted into a war they barely understood. Exposure, hunger, and exhaustion had stripped away the bravado encouraged by propaganda. Their arrival at American field hospitals was not only a logistical necessity, but an emotional shock. To be offered warmth and care by those who could easily have treated them with hostility was disorienting. Reports from survivors later described feelings of disbelief, confusion, and cautious gratitude. In some cases, soldiers hesitated, unsure whether the gesture was a trap. The trust required to accept such kindness was earned in small, deliberate steps. A blanket folded neatly, a nurse's calm voice, a simple offering of hot broth. The practical aspects of care were as critical as the emotional ones. Nurses administered basic triage, stabilizing fractures and wounds, and preventing infection, a constant threat in sub-zero temperatures. Hypothermia was treated as aggressively as gunshot wounds. Blankets were not merely comfort items. They were survival tools, preserving body heat, preventing illness, and giving soldiers the strength to endure. Every action, from wrapping a soldier's hands to securing a heated cot, was an intervention against the relentless cold and the weariness that threatened to claim life itself. Field hospitals also served a tactical purpose. By ensuring the survival of enemy soldiers, medics preserved the possibility of prisoner exchanges and reduced the chaos of untracked wounded on the battlefield. Yet these practical considerations never overshadowed the human impact. Each encounter, each German soldier wrapped in a warm blanket, each nurse offering a reassuring word, was a moment where the ideology of war bowed, however briefly, to the shared experience of suffering and survival. It was within this convergence of desperation and compassion that the stage was set for the moments of shock that would define this narrative. Soldiers who had braced themselves for bullets and scorn instead found blankets, bandages, and the quiet, steady hands of nurses guiding them back from the brink. In the frozen stillness of the Ardennes, amidst the ruins of conflict, these acts of care became profound statements of humanity, echoing far beyond the boundaries of the battlefield. As the snow continued to fall, the first German soldiers approached the field hospitals, hesitant, skeptical, and utterly unprepared for what awaited them. The moment of confrontation, their shock, their disbelief, and the unexpected warmth would become the defining turning point in this story, a human vignette against the backdrop of one of the war's most brutal campaigns. The human dimension of this moment cannot be overstated. German soldiers, many barely out of their teens, had endured weeks of relentless cold, hunger, and fear. Their bodies were rigid from frostbite, their hands trembling from exposure, their minds weighed down by the endless cycle of retreat and bombardment. When they first encountered the American nurses, their reaction was a complex mix of disbelief and suspicion. Years of military indoctrination had trained them to expect hostility, not care. Yet here, in a small clearing behind the front lines, warmth and compassion were offered freely. The simple act of receiving a blanket became an emotional jolt, a reminder that survival could coexist with humanity, even in the midst of total war. Many soldiers later recalled feeling a strange, almost guilt-ridden relief, the recognition that their enemy could also display mercy. Tactical angle. From a tactical perspective, the provision of care to enemy soldiers carried subtle but significant consequences. Field hospitals were not only sites of healing. They were instruments of morale management and battlefield efficiency. By stabilizing wounded German soldiers, the Allies prevented chaos that could disrupt operations and reduce battlefield control. Even if these soldiers would later return to the front or be detained as prisoners, the immediate effect was a reduction in uncontrolled casualties and an increase in operational order. Moreover, soldiers who witnessed their comrades being treated humanely experienced a psychological shift. The shock of kindness could temporarily neutralize hostility, making surrender less perilous and compliance more likely, which in turn reduced needless bloodshed. Technological and medical angle. The technological and medical infrastructure behind this act of compassion was critical. Blankets, stoves, portable medical kits, and triage protocols were all meticulously organized to maximize impact under extreme conditions. In sub-zero temperatures, a simple wool blanket could mean the difference between life and death. Nurses and medics used field techniques to prevent hypothermia, manage frostbite, and stabilize wounds with limited supplies. Portable heaters, hot water, and pre-prepared bandages enabled them to work efficiently in tents and makeshift shelters. Even the sequencing of care, prioritizing the most vulnerable, wrapping the severely frostbitten first, and maintaining hygiene under difficult circumstances, demonstrated a sophisticated application of medical science in a war zone. The technology was simple, but the disciplined, systematic approach ensured that the soldiers' survival rates were maximized. The intersection of these human, tactical, and technological factors created a moment that was far greater than the sum of its parts. Soldier shock was not simply emotional. It was amplified by the precision and care with which their survival was ensured. Blankets were not just cloth. They were survival tools, symbols of order, and tokens of unexpected humanity. Nurses and medics were not only caregivers, but instruments of psychological and operational influence, their actions rippling across the battlefield in ways both immediate and enduring. The impact of these interactions will be magnified when considered from the perspective of the nurses themselves. Their courage, empathy, and dedication shaped the battlefield in subtle ways that extended beyond medical care alone. The ethical and moral weight of their decisions, the choice to tend to enemy soldiers, the determination to preserve life even amidst hostility, would frame the next set of angles, revealing a deeper understanding of leadership, ethics, and the human cost of war. Leadership during this period of the Ardennes campaign was a study in contrasts. On one side, German commanders struggled with failing supply lines, harsh weather, and the deteriorating morale of their troops. Orders often seemed detached from reality, and many officers were forced to witness the suffering of their men without the means to alleviate it. Conversely, American leaders behind the front lines had to coordinate field hospitals under constant risk of artillery fire, ensuring that both Allied and enemy wounded received timely care. Decisions were precise and deliberate. Which tents would receive the most vulnerable, how many blankets could be spared, how to maintain operational efficiency while upholding ethical standards. The ability of commanders to trust their medical teams and support their actions was crucial. Without clear leadership backing, nurses and medics would have faced delays, shortages, and moral hesitation, potentially costing lives. Leadership here was not about battlefield tactics alone. It was about creating conditions where humanity could survive amidst the machinery of war. Tactical angle. From a tactical perspective, the provision of care to enemy soldiers carried subtle but significant consequences. Field hospitals were not only sites of healing. They were instruments of morale management and battlefield efficiency. By stabilizing wounded German soldiers, the Allies prevented chaos that could disrupt operations and reduce battlefield control. Even if these soldiers would later return to the front or be detained as prisoners, the immediate effect was a reduction in uncontrolled casualties and an increase in operational order. Moreover, soldiers who witnessed their comrades being treated humanely experienced a psychological shift. The shock of kindness could temporarily neutralize hostility, making surrender less perilous and compliance more likely, which in turn reduced needless bloodshed. Technological and medical angle. The technological and medical infrastructure behind this act of compassion was critical. Blankets, stoves, portable medical kits, and triage protocols were all meticulously organized to maximize impact under extreme conditions. In sub-zero temperatures, a simple wool blanket could mean the difference between life and death. Nurses and medics used field techniques to prevent hypothermia, manage frostbite, and stabilize wounds with limited supplies. Portable heaters, hot water, and pre-prepared bandages enabled them to work efficiently in tents and makeshift shelters. Even the sequencing of care, prioritizing the most vulnerable, wrapping the severely frostbitten first, and maintaining hygiene under difficult circumstances, demonstrated a sophisticated application of medical science in a war zone. The technology was simple, but the disciplined, systematic approach ensured that the soldiers' survival rates were maximized. The intersection of these human, tactical, and technological factors created a moment that was far greater than the sum of its parts. Soldiers' shock was not simply emotional. It was amplified by the precision and care with which their survival was ensured. Blankets were not just cloth. They were survival tools, symbols of order, and tokens of unexpected humanity. Nurses and medics were not only caregivers, but instruments of psychological and operational influence, their actions rippling across the battlefield in ways both immediate and enduring. The impact of these interactions would be magnified when considered from the perspective of the nurses themselves. Their courage, empathy, and dedication shaped the battlefield in subtle ways that extended beyond medical care alone. The ethical and moral weight of their decisions, the choice to tend to enemy soldiers, the determination to preserve life even amidst hostility, would frame the next set of angles, revealing a deeper understanding of leadership, ethics, and the human cost of war. Leadership during this period of the Ardennes campaign was a study in contrasts. On one side, German commanders struggled with failing supply lines, harsh weather, and the deteriorating morale of their troops. Orders often seemed detached from reality, and many officers were forced to witness the suffering of their men without the means to alleviate it. Conversely, American leaders behind the front lines had to coordinate field hospitals under constant risk of artillery fire, ensuring that both Allied and enemy wounded received timely care. Decisions were precise and deliberate. Which tents would receive the most vulnerable, how many blankets could be spared, how to maintain operational efficiency while upholding ethical standards. The ability of commanders to trust their medical teams and support their actions was crucial. Without clear leadership backing, nurses and medics would have faced delays, shortages, and moral hesitation, potentially costing lives. Leadership here was not about battlefield tactics alone. It was about creating conditions where humanity could survive amidst the machinery of war. Moral/ethical angle. The moral dimension of tending to enemy soldiers under fire added layers of complexity. Nurses and medics were acutely aware that the men they treated had fought against their own comrades. Yet in these moments, ideology and nationalism receded. The Geneva Conventions provided a legal framework, but ethical courage went beyond compliance. Choosing to care for someone conditioned to be an enemy required emotional resilience and a deliberate affirmation of humanity. Diaries and letters from nurses of the time describe moments of hesitation, internal conflict, and ultimate resolve. Their decision to offer blankets, food, and medical attention was simultaneously practical and profoundly moral. These acts embodied the principle that even in total war, there are lines drawn not by national allegiance, but by human decency. Enemy perspective. For the German soldiers, the experience was surreal. Conditioned to expect brutality, they approached the field hospitals cautiously, scanning for threats, bracing for hostility. When met instead with warmth and care, their reactions ranged from disbelief to cautious relief. Some froze, unable to process the incongruity of compassion in the midst of conflict. Others hesitated, unsure if accepting aid might be a trap. Diaries, post-war interviews, and surviving letters reveal that the impact was immediate and profound. Men who had been hardened by months of retreat found themselves emotionally disarmed. The simple act of receiving a blanket or a hot meal became symbolic, a tangible reminder that survival and decency were still possible. In some cases, these encounters reshaped soldiers' perceptions of the enemy, humanizing the other side in ways that military doctrine often sought to suppress. Connecting the angles. Taken together, these perspectives illuminate the complexity of what might appear as a simple act of care. Leadership provided the structural support, ethics demanded courage, and the human experience captured the emotional resonance. Technology and medical practice ensured survival, while the unexpected kindness imposed psychological and moral consequences far beyond the immediate moment. Soldier shock was not merely a reaction to warmth. It was a confrontation with the very idea that humanity could exist in the midst of destruction. These angles converge to prepare the narrative for the climax/turning point. The moment when German soldiers, frozen, battered, and exhausted, directly encounter American nurses. Here, the principles of leadership, ethics, and human decency meet the raw, palpable reality of war. The shock, relief, and fragile trust experienced in these moments would define the emotional and historical heart of this story, shaping both immediate survival and enduring memory. January 18th, 1945. The snow continued to fall in thick, muffling layers, covering the shattered remnants of the Ardennes battlefield. German soldiers, huddled in ragged lines, approached the American field hospital with cautious steps. Their faces were pale, etched with exhaustion, and their eyes darted nervously between the tents, the flickering lanterns, and the nurses moving with steady efficiency. They had expected interrogation, suspicion, or outright hostility. What greeted them instead was something entirely unanticipated: warmth. The first soldier, barely able to lift his gaze, shuffled toward a nurse holding a stack of blankets. She extended her hands without words, the soft wool contrasting sharply with the biting cold. His fingers trembled as he took the gift, confusion washing over his face. Around him, others watched, hesitant, questioning the reality of such kindness. Murmurs passed among them, whispers in German that betrayed disbelief and uncertainty. The battlefield had taught them fear, suspicion, and brutality. Yet here, amidst the snow and wreckage, they encountered compassion. Nurses moved with practiced precision, assessing each man for frostbite, dehydration, and injury. Hot soup was ladled into tin cups. Blankets were wrapped around shivering shoulders, and bandages were applied with gentle care. Every action was deliberate, aimed at stabilizing the body, yes, but also at offering reassurance, a fragile bridge between enemy lines. The soldier's shock was compounded by the nurse's calm demeanor. They treated each man as if he were merely another patient, not a foe, not an enemy, not a statistic. This simple recognition of the men as human beings struck deeply, unsettling the psychological armor that months of war had built. One soldier, a young conscript with frostbitten fingers, froze when offered soup. He looked from a nurse to the blanket in her hands, then to his comrades who had already accepted aid. A brief hesitation held him in place, a suspended moment where fear, disbelief, and survival collided. Then, almost imperceptibly, he stepped forward, reaching for the warmth extended to him. Around him, others followed in silence, the snow crunching beneath boots that had walked miles in despair. The nurses, acutely aware of the delicate balance between care and chaos, maintained control with quiet authority. They spoke softly, guiding the soldiers to cots, encouraging them to rest, ensuring no one succumbed to the cold while awaiting treatment. The field hospital became a sanctuary, a temporary pause in the relentless rhythm of the Ardennes. Here, human vulnerability intersected with deliberate compassion, creating a moment of intense emotional resonance. Even for the nurses, the scene carried weight. Years of training, exhaustion, and exposure to battlefield horror had steeled them against shock, but the sight of enemy soldiers, previously faceless threats, receiving warmth and aid was profoundly moving. Some later wrote that in these moments, they felt the full moral gravity of their profession, the power to preserve life, to uphold dignity, to defy the brutality of war through simple acts of care. Outside the tents, the battlefield remained unforgiving. Artillery fire echoed faintly in the distance, and the wind cut through layers of fabric and fur. Yet within this small clearing, the cycle of violence seemed to pause. Soldiers, their shock gradually giving way to fragile relief, huddled under blankets, drank hot soup, and allowed themselves to be tended. In their eyes, a subtle transformation occurred. Mistrust shifted to cautious acceptance, fear to fleeting comfort, and the rigid lines between enemy and human began to blur. This was the turning point. Not a battle won or lost, but a human victory, a testament to the unexpected power of care in the midst of destruction. The soldier's shock was palpable, but it carried with it a new understanding. Even in war, kindness could survive, and humanity could persist against overwhelming odds. The stage was set for deeper, individual stories of transformation and emotional revelation, which would intensify the impact of this moment and lead naturally into the second part of the climax, where these encounters reach their full emotional and historical resonance. The morning after the first encounters, the field hospital hummed with quiet intensity. German soldiers, now more willing to approach, arrived in small groups. Each man carried the weariness of countless miles, the ache of frozen limbs, and the mental scars of relentless combat. Yet with each step into the tents, the atmosphere shifted. The nurses moved among them with a practiced gentleness, offering blankets, hot broth, and calm reassurance. For the soldiers, this simple human contact was transformative. One young infantryman, only 17, had spent the night shivering in a shell crater. When a nurse wrapped a thick wool blanket around his shoulders, he froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. A small, tremulous smile appeared, an expression foreign to the hardened mask he wore on the battlefield. Another soldier, clutching a bandaged arm, stared at the nurse who poured hot soup into a tin cup. His lips parted in a silent, incredulous "why?" before he whispered a hesitant "Danke." The gestures were small, almost imperceptible, but they marked a profound internal shift, the recognition that care and empathy could exist even from those labeled as enemies. The nurses themselves faced the same tension they had in the previous hours, balancing efficiency with compassion, managing scarce supplies, and maintaining order among men who had been trained to distrust. Yet they persisted, understanding that their mission went beyond medical treatment. Every blanket handed out, every soothing word spoken, was a deliberate act of humanity, a statement that war's brutality could not erase moral responsibility. Their courage was quiet, understated, but deeply impactful. Beyond the immediate care, the reactions of the German soldiers revealed the psychological power of compassion. Those who had once walked the battlefield expecting hostility now felt disarmed. Suspicion gradually gave way to cautious trust. Men who had spent days huddled alone, anticipating only suffering, found themselves embraced by warmth and reassurance. The effect rippled outward. Groups of soldiers who had been hesitant began to move with more confidence, accepting aid without fear, some even assisting one another under the guidance of nurses. The interaction also had subtle strategic implications. By stabilizing the wounded and offering care, the Americans reduced the risk of chaotic stragglers on the battlefield, decreased potential resistance during prisoner transfers, and demonstrated moral superiority, a fact not lost on the soldiers who observed the organized, efficient care of their adversaries. The lines between military strategy and human compassion blurred, revealing how ethics and effectiveness could coexist even amid war.